With an irritated grunt, Katharina tried to pull free of Tsunami, but he continued to drag her along with him as he hurried around a corner into a small alley and out of the guard's sight. He then spotted a barn and quickly dragged her over to it as 3 more guards started heading their way. However, as they entered, Katharina pulled her arm free from the seer and kicked the back of his right leg, sending him stumbling forward. Unable to keep his balance, Tsunami stumbled and tripped, crash landing into one of the barn's water barrels. Then, Katharina swiftly pulled her shimmering purple sword from its sheath and pointed it at him as he sat in the water.
Are you following me?
She yelled furiously. Holding up his hands in surrender as water dripped from his sleeves, Tsunami pouted.
I live here,
he repeated.
You live in a barn?
She frowned, looking around slowly, rolling her eyes in disgust as a pig scurried from one pen and into another.
No!
He exclaimed.
I live in this city.
He insisted, moving to climb out of the water, but Katharina moved her blade closer to him, keeping him where he was. He gulped nervously as he stared at the end of her blade.
I did mention it back in the valley.
No, you didn't.
She insisted.
Pretty sure I did. You were just too busy ignoring me, so...
Katharina grunted irritably and moved her blade even closer so that it was just an inch from his face.
Whether you live here or not,
she said, looking around at the barn again.
How did you get here before me? You don't even have a horse,
she asked in confusion. Tsunami shrugged.
Let's just say I know my way.
Oh, shut up!
She snapped, cutting him off. She turned around and sheathed her sword, but as she started making her way towards the door, Tsunami scrambled out of the water and scurried after her. She swung around and pointed at him with her finger.
Stay out of my way,
she warned, glaring at Tsunami. He shrugged again.
Yeah, sure thing. No problem. You won't see me here again,
he assured her. Glowering at him, she pouted irritably, but turned back around and stormed over to the door. She pulled it open and slammed it shut.
Tsunami stood there as the force of the door shutting shook the entire barn. Dust fell from the ceiling and onto his sweater. Then, before he could evade, a bucket fell from above and crashed down on top of his head. He grunted painfully as the bucket hit him and then fell to the ground.
God,
he grumbled, rubbing his head.
I was just trying to help.
He shrugged, looking over at the pig that had run across the barn earlier. Peering out from behind the pen it had ran into, the pig snorted at him and walked off.
Whatever,
he grumbled.
Outside the barn, Katharina reunited with Spirit, who was munching on the dying white flowers from someone's garden. As Katharina grabbed her reins, the unicorn quickly snatched a mouthful of flowers in her teeth and followed, chewing happily on them as they crumbled against her teeth. Katharina made her way out of the alley and onto the main path that led to the city center. She stared ahead as she made her way towards an archway, setting her eyes on a huge clock tower standing tall within the center, towering over all of the other brick-built buildings. But it wasn't just its size that stuck out. The clock tower was shimmering a bright gold and looked to be made solely of the metal. The clock hands were black, the clock's glass cover reflecting the grey clouds as they lingered overhead. Small schools of fish were swimming around the clock tower's roof, several small lights glistening from within the tiny windows. The path to the city was also lined with the same strange lights Katharina had seen outside, the wires loose and fizzling. She gazed in fascination as a lone pink, guppy-like fish swam around one of the lights, its scales shimmering elegantly as it did. But the sound of the crowds ahead startled the small amphibian, and as it swam away to join a school above it, Katharina focused her attention on the crowds. There were a lot of people up ahead, rushing around, yelling, chopping at the few stalls she could now see as she made her way closer. She She walked under the archway, emerging into the marketplace. She instantly set her eyes on the clock tower again, seeing that it was connected to a large brown brick building lined with darker wooden paneling. A tall, wide archway cut through its center, leading to another part of the city. She then shifted her eyes to a tall stone pillar that erected from the ground in the center of the marketplace, fire burning brightly atop it. Small schools of fish were swimming around it, attracted to the light. However, the irritating feeling that she was being followed was poking at her patience. She stopped in her tracks and sharply turned her head, looking back over her shoulder. But there was no one there. She rolled her eyes and continued forward, Spirit grabbing a carrot from someone's yard as they passed.
Covering behind a small barrel, Tsunami exhaled in relief, worried that Katharina was going to catch him. As he heard her unicorn's hooves trotting once again, he peeked over the barrel and watched as Katharina moved into the crowds of the city center's marketplace. Worried that he was going to lose her, he scrambled to his feet and rushed forward, hurrying to join the crowds too.
Reaching the fire-topped pillar, Katharina stopped for a moment and looked around. She searched the crowds of smartly dressed, obviously rich people and set her eyes on another notice board, spotting a poster calling for the werewolf. Unlike the poster she had got outside the city, this one had a drawing of the beast in question, so she hastily made her way over, ignoring the tutting, mumbling people. Once she reached it, she pulled the paper from the board, replacing it with the older poster. Looking at it, she frowned, seeing that the beast was standing upright.
Huh. I guess it's an alpha we're after.
She realized, looking up at Spirit.
They're the only kind of werewolf that stand like this.
Spirit snorted quietly, whipping her tail against her leg, whacking a small fish away. Sighing, Katharina looked around again and spotted a food stall.
Well, I guess I better start asking around for more information.
She mumbled as she made her way over. Reaching the food stall, she was instantly met with a skeptical stare. The owner looked down at her with his dull green eyes, his skin cleaner than any of the people Katharina had seen outside of the city. His silky, frill-laced clothes and leather top hat alone looked to be worth more than everything she owned, and as she looked down at the exquisite foods he had on offer, she realized that she was in a richer part of the city. Did that matter? She wasn't sure yet. She looked up at him and held out the poster.
Know anything about this werewolf?
She asked, showing him the drawing. He looked at her for a few moments, a judging look in his eyes as he stared at her violet eyes, her magenta hair. But he then sighed and looked at the poster.
You here to hunt that thing?
He asked, concern in his high-pitched voice, his grey hair floating gently in the bitter breeze.
Ain't had a seer on the case yet, but those that live here don't seem to care.
She nodded. He crossed his arms.
Well, it is just about time someone else showed up. That thing has been bothering us for such a long time,
he said.
It disappeared a few days ago, though, and hasn't been seen since. I don't know too much, only heard rumors.
Katharina frowned.
How long ago exactly?
The stall owner shrugged.
The night of the full moon, I believe.
That was last night.
She grumbled, a vacant look on her face.
It was?
He asked, scratching his head.
Ha! What do you know?
He laughed.
I never leave my home after the sun starts to set.
She deadpanned.
Humans are dumber than I thought.
He went to speak, but she turned around and walked off. As she did, Spirit grunted in the man's face, silencing him. Spotting a small, red-haired woman strutting away from a flower stall in her bright red heels, Katharina hurried over. She stopped the woman in her tracks and held out the poster.
Do you know anything about this werewolf?
Holding her hand against her chest in shock, the woman gasped, the look of revolt on her face greener than her ankle-length dress.
I'm here to hunt it,
Katharina added, growing impatient. The woman turned her nose up at Katharina.
I say,
She called.
what a rude little girl.
As the woman strutted off, Spirit snorted, spraying the back of the woman's hair with snot. She screamed and hurried off, muttering all manner of insults that Katharina didn't care to listen to. Katharina quickly shifted her attention to a small stall selling crystals and made her way over. But as she showed the acne-covered stall owner the poster, he pouted and shook his head.
No one down here's seen it, kid.
Down here?
She asked.
Yeah, the rich folk ain't none of them seen it.
He said, his voice less uppity than everyone else she had spoken to. His clothes were also dirtied and ripped near the arms. Clearly, he wasn't as well off as everyone else swarming the market. So, what was he doing there? All the other stall owners looked just as wealthy as their clients. Hoping he had some information worth her time, she crossed her arms.
Well, who has seen it? Someone has to have seen it, otherwise this poster wouldn't exist.
He cleared his throat and scratched half a dozen red spots on his face at once.
You want to head to the slums, near the Sea Fort. Things been seen a lot round there.
Relieved that someone had given her something useful, she sighed.
Thanks.
She mumbled, walking off. But as she turned her back on him, she caught sight of several people dotted around the area glaring at her. As soon as they noticed her, they turned away, mumbling quietly to one another. She didn't care. She knew she didn't belong there, but that wasn't going to stop her from doing what she had come to do. Now, she knew that no one that looked to be worth quite a bit of money would know anything, so she had to look for people similar to the acne-covered stall owner she had just spoken to. With her new information, she scanned the area as she walked around and quickly set her eyes on a scruffy-dressed man sitting at an outside bar. His dark brown hair was almost shoulder-length and slightly wavy, and somehow, it looked as if he hadn't bothered with it for a while. The majority of his bare skin was covered in tattoos, so Katharina assumed that he must be a little tougher than anyone else she could see around him. She made her way over and stopped beside him.
Know anything about the werewolf plaguing this place?
She asked, holding out the poster. Slowly, he took his eyes off his drink and looked down at her.
What?
He asked, a confused look on his tired face. As they made eye contact, Katharina stopped for a moment. His grubby face was dotted with dirt, his stubble scattered all over the place. His eyes were a dull grey and possessed a look that told Katharina he had no idea where he was. Something about this guy had her on edge, but she wasn't quite sure what it was yet. Ignoring his appearance, she slammed the poster onto the table.
The freaking werewolf!
She growled impatiently. He blinked slowly.
Werewolf.
Frustrated, she exclaimed quietly and stormed off. The tattooed man watched as she left and then looked back down at his drink. And just a few seconds later, his eyes rolled to the back of his head and he passed out, his face hitting the table with a loud thump.